Hi, my name is Elle Billing. I am a chronically ill queer femme, and I'm tired. I'm here this episode and every episode to dig at the roots of our collective fatigue, explore ways to direct our care in compassionate and sustainable ways, and harness creative expression to heal ourselves and our world. And welcome to HURF, Radical Care in a Late Capitalist Hexscape. My guest today is Chloe Specht. Chloe is a queer, autistic writer, theologian, and spiritual caregiver. She holds a Master of Divinity and is a candidate for pastoral ordination in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Chloe was raised in high-demand Christian spaces as a homeschooled pastor's kid, but now works to create inclusive, liberating spiritual communities. Well, hi, Chloe. Welcome to HURF. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. You know this, but the listeners don't. I encountered you on Instagram, like we encounter so many people that we know and respect these days. And like it says in your bio, you're a theologian and you grew up a pastor's kid, and now you are pursuing your ordination in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So I'm just excited for this conversation. I grew up in the church too. I grew up Lutheran, and I've kind of hopped around a little bit from church to church over the years. And I'm glad that there's like a word for deconstruction now, because
yes,
like when I first, I think, started deconstructing, there wasn't like a community or a name for it. But I'm jumping ahead. We'll get to that. I'm just, I've been excited about this for a couple of weeks since I got a hold of you. Since this is a podcast about care, one of the questions I ask all my guests is, how have you received care this week?
I think this week, one way that I have received care this week is just through the presence of my friends. I feel like I always come back refreshed from just a good conversation where I didn't feel like there was anything to prove to anyone, that you can just be, and however you are is perfectly accepted and loved just as it is. And I have had a few conversations with friends like that this week that have meant a lot to me. So, yeah.
Those are great types of relationships to have, where you don't have to prove yourself and you don't have to earn anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And just getting that care from the people that we get to have and choose to have in our lives. That's really lovely. Is there anything that still needs care? Like, you came away from those conversations feeling really refreshed and cared for. Like, is there anything that still feels like you need care? Something in like that's going on, and if it's too personal, you don't have to answer. But is there anything in your life, like right now, this week, that still needs care?
Yeah, definitely. I am in a season of trying to be really intentional with self-care, because I have the privilege of being able to take some time away from work right now. I just wrapped up my last job the 1st of September, and I am kind of on like a 2-month hiatus here before my next thing. And I have kind of run myself ragged in school and work for the last probably 7 or 8 years. And so I have been trying to take some time to actually rest and not be kind of policed by my to-do list. I'm one of those people that I find it really easy to just find more and more things to do, and the list grows longer and longer. And even though I'm doing so much, increasingly feel like I haven't done enough. And
I know that feeling.
yes, so I am in a space right now where I'm trying to sleep more, trying to not be so task oriented, and just enjoy my life and just enjoy existing.
That's nice. That sounds
Yes.
nice. Not that necessarily that you had to get to that point where you had to go, whoa, hold on, I need to do something different, but also but that you're able to do that too and say, hang on, I need sleep. I need rest.
Yes.
I need to disconnect from the task list. I have task lists, but it's because things fall out of my brain. And I'm like, I was going to do things and I don't know what any of them were.
Yeah.
Which is its own tyranny, I think, of trying to remember everything that I'm trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as part of your self-care, do you have a creative practice?
I do. Yes. I enjoy little crafts and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have crocheted for like over a decade now. And that's something that I really enjoy. That at this point, like I've done it for so long that it's somewhat of like not a completely mindless task, but it's one of those things that you can do that just out of habit,
Mm-hmm.
and your brain knows what to do, and you feel like you can kind of turn off for a little bit and just kind of have some clear space in your mind. Almost, it reminds me of how some people like describe meditating. Like that for me is a lot of times what like crochet and embroidery and like little crafts like that is for me.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to, I think some people think of like creativity as being like continually like stimulated all of the time,
Mm-hmm.
but you need the reset time too,
Right.
in order to like process and then keep going, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, I'm a painter, but I've also dabbled in lots of other creative arts over the years. Like for me, knitting had that meditative quality because it's really repetitive and I have to count stitches because I'm counting stitches and I'm using both hands and I have to hold the yarn a certain way. Like nothing else can occupy my brain, which it is a rare day when I can get everything else to like quiet down. So knitting was really good for me that way. Painting's a little different because that's usually when like everything is like, but I also have to cultivate a certain amount of boredom, like to the processing and like to get the ideas and to percolate them down and to figure out what I'm doing. It's the cycles of work and rest kind of leave some fallow ground, I guess.
For sure.
And I never realized boredom was something I would have to cultivate. I'm not good at being bored.
Me neither.
Yeah. But just being able to like sit and let my mind wander. And it's a little easier here now that I'm out on the farm with living with my folks again. And there's not a whole lot to do. But instead of constantly trying to make myself find something to do, I'm like, I'll just go walk outside with the dog. I'll throw the ball for a while. And it's nice. And I'm glad crocheting has that like kind of calming, meditative effect for you too. I tried crocheting, but my other hand would get bored. Like I have to, like I really have to engage both hands. And when I'm painting, sometimes I switch to my non-dominant hand too, and I make a really big mess that then I clean up later with my other hand. I mentioned a little bit ago when we first started about deconstruction, which huge concept, one word, like so many things, right? So you grew up in the evangelical church.
I did.
Yeah.
Yes.
I grew up in a mainline church, I guess. I guess for people who are in the Christian church or in Christian denominations, those two words make sense. But for people who are outside Christianity, even those words are like, well, what is the difference? Mainline, evangelical. So the mainline denominations would be like Catholic, Lutheran. I grew up in a small town. We had like 3 churches.
Yeah.
And they were all mainline. And then evangelical are the ones that are not those. I mean, can you explain it better than me? And we can go from there.
Yeah, I think the lines are a little bit blurred, honestly, there, because I think that it really depends on like how we're distinguishing evangelical from mainline, and like, do we distinguish like fundamentalism from evangelicalism as well? And like, that's a whole nother layer. And so I think it rightfully can be very confusing sometimes to try to like sort out that puzzle. But I think a lot of churches that would be considered evangelical are kind of emerged out of a certain era of Christianity in other places in the world too, but like emerged out of a certain era for an American context, out of like a resistance to what would typically be considered mainline denominations, like the Lutheran Church or the Episcopal Church or the Presbyterian Church, something like that. And evangelicalism was initially kind of a response to, I think, some of the issues that folks were having in those churches.
Okay.
And so they were like, we're going to start something new and different. And it's kind of, I think, honestly, today, like evangelicalism is, again, depending on how you define it, is maybe 150 years old. And it's kind of like evolved to a point where probably the original kind of forerunners in evangelical spaces would not recognize this movement, because I think initially it kind of emerged out of like Christian revival spaces and was more kind of like socially conscious in some ways, not perfect, still very white. And in some ways, evangelicalism is still political, but not in a way that I would consider like socially conscious, more like socially reactive.
As a little background, like I mentioned, I grew up Lutheran, but the name of our church is ELCA. So it's the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, but it's not really considered part of evangelicalism when most people think and talk about evangelicalism. So it can be confusing for people when I'm like, yeah, that's the Evangelical Lutheran Church, but it's not really like it is, but it isn't. And then, so my hometown has like a Catholic church, 2 Lutheran churches, a Methodist church. Well, now they have 3 Lutheran churches. 3 of them. And then a Kingdom Hall. And so I was sort of sheltered to an extent. My hometown has 1,000 people. We mostly had mainline denominations. It wasn't really until I went to college that I was exposed to any of what we would probably call contemporary evangelicalism. But even then I was at a Lutheran university. And so like taking biology at a Christian college, some people would be like, you did what? But like it was at a liberal arts Lutheran university. So yeah, it was biology class. But like 2 blocks north of us was a North American Baptist college. And I had friends who went there who were like, you're taking biology? You're going to teach life science in a public school? I think you need to reassess the status of your salvation. And that was the first time I'd heard any of that. And I was like, what? And that was really my first exposure to, somehow I made it to be like 20 years old. And I wasn't really exposed to much of the culture wars except some of the gay stuff. because I'm
yeah.
queer. And so like that, you know, some of that kind of got to me enough to be like scared and not talk
Yeah.
about it. And that was the point, I think, by my senior year where I was at the point where like, what is any of this?
Yeah.
And now we kind of have a word for that. And now like deconstruction makes sense as a term for me and I hear it everywhere. But in 2006, people either were in church or they left church. And there wasn't really a movement of like ex-evangelicals or, you know, people who, I mean, there were people who were trying to have reform movements within denominations and stuff, but it was kind of a lonely process for a lot of individuals, I think.
Yeah.
So since you're the one who has studied these things and I am not, I'm wondering if you can give an overview of a very complex topic, but of what ex-evangelicalism, if it is an ism, like it's more like people who used to be evangelical and aren't, but what deconstruction kind of looks like or what that has looked like for you personally.
For sure. Yeah. In my life, deconstruction has looked like the conscious and intentional evaluating of the religious beliefs that I was raised with, kind of determining like if those are beliefs that I still want to carry with me, if I still think are true, if I still think are valuable. I think that deconstruction is an active process. I personally don't like to use the language that like I have deconstructed. I always say it in an active way, like I am deconstructing. I feel like in some ways, I think deconstruction is kind of a universal human experience of like all human beings grow up and decide if the beliefs that they were raised with are still beliefs that they want to hold on to or if they want to let go of them. And I think religious deconstruction is more specific right now to Christianity and like a response to a lot of like conservative or otherwise like restrictive forms, high demand forms of Christian faith that exists right now. And I think deconstruction is a little bit different than just leaving the church. You know, I think deconstruction is often a process that starts while many of us are still in church. And we're kind of fed some ideas and we're like, I don't know if that's right. I don't know if I really believe that. I don't know if I really want to like accept that. And I think that often deconstruction does cause us to leave the church, maybe not necessarily leave Christian faith. Actually, one thing that I really love about the deconstruction community is that it's not kind of segmented off into two groups of like, here are the deconstructing people who are like still spiritual in some type of way, and here are the deconstructing people that are not spiritual or religious. I like that they're, at least in digital spaces, are a mix of both. And I have learned so much from folks who are deconstructing that would still consider themselves religious and some who wouldn't, you know? I think that having the mix of those voices, a mix of voices there, those, you know, who would identify it as spiritual and those who wouldn't, really is an asset to the community. And I think it reminds people that this movement is about finding freedom and finding liberation. It's not about making you conform to some other way of being. And I'm not saying that the deconstruction community always practices that well, because clearly there have been a lot of issues, a lot of things that have come up online, like even in the last year, of like folks who abused their power or misrepresented themselves in some way. And a lot of that comes from the white folks who are not decolonizing their ways of thinking and are not continuing to deconstruct in those ways. Folks who are not actively seeking to become anti-racist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, yeah, deconstruction is still an ongoing process for me. And I think it always will be. And I think deconstruction is just part of kind of the cycles of like unlearning and learning that all human beings do in life. And this just happens to be, in a religious context.
Right.
In a way, I think deconstruction is just a part of being human.
That really resonates with me. Now like I've said probably too many times now, like I'm glad we have a terminology for it, because when we can name something, it's much easier for one to talk about it, but we can identify what it is that we're doing and we can find community. It wasn't until I was 19 that I knew I knew gay and straight, from the time I was young, but it wasn't until I was like 19 that I knew, oh, bisexual is a thing that exists. Like I can find other people like me. And it made a huge difference in my sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And the same thing with deconstruction, the number of times I've gone through kind of an unlearning and almost reconstruction process with my spirituality and my faith, now that we have a way to talk about it besides I'm wrestling, which I mean that works too, but to talk about it more precisely is helpful, and it helps us, especially in digital spaces, find other people who are experiencing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just the cycles of unlearning and learning. And then when I was in college, it was because of, how the church I was attending was excluding LGBTQ people. And then, later when I was a little bit older, it was because of income inequality. And then I was sort of settled down a little bit. And then I attended in a language immersion program, which opened my eyes to, like, I knew about the colonialism of the church, but like hadn't really read details. And then I read the details and I was like, I have some thinking to do. And it's that anti-colonial, anti-racist piece of it it's like 3 years of like really trying to decide what's worth hanging on to. And I love how you said it's not necessarily about people leaving the church. Like some people do. But for me, I'm deconstructing because I want to know which pieces to hang on to. Because there are some pieces that I cherish. And it's not because I want to walk away. It's because like some of this stuff is so meaningful to me, but I want to like cut the rest that is harming me and harming other people and preventing us from doing community better in a way that doesn't harm people. We have a few things in common, and other things that are not in common at all. You're from the South,
yes,
or the Appalachian area. I'm from North Dakota. That's a little different, but there's other things about the two of us that we have in common, and maybe our journeys are really more different than I know, or maybe more similar. For me, initially, deconstructing was really lonely. And I'm wondering if it was similar for you, or if through deconstructing you were actually able to solve some isolation problems and find community.
Yeah, I think for me, it was really the latter. I think that deconstructing helped me to gain an authentic community. Because, I mean, I had folks in my life who I thought were my friends, who I felt like we were like somewhat close, maybe not like best friends, but who I felt, at least in some ways, like supported by and loved by. And through the process of deconstructing and being more open about my shifting beliefs. Initially, it did feel more isolating because kind of at the height, I think, of the isolation of deconstructing, I was at a very homophobic seminary, trying to go to school there. And I got kicked out of a church for being too liberal in some ways and like too open about the different kinds of beliefs I had. And not even like I was interning at a congregation that I had known for years, and had known the pastors for years. And I wasn't sharing as much like with the folks I was helping to like lead and minister to, but I was just open with the pastors who were supposed to be mentoring me, because that's part of the practice of like being mentored, is like you're vulnerable with each other and you help one another grow and learn. And so I just like assumed they were safe people and shared with them very candidly, and it blew up in my face, and did not end well. But even after that, like really low point of feeling like very lonely and rejected in that time, I still had a digital community that I belonged to, who I still felt supported by. And I also was able to eventually, in the months after that, find another congregation who did love me truly just as I am, and not conditionally, and they were not afraid of my ideas, and they were not, they were not resistant to different ways of thinking about things. And so I think for me, it's kind of been a both and, where like initially it was like a lonely, isolating experience, but eventually like that kind of, there was a break in that, and, I was able to form a better community. I feel like a more supportive and loving community in a shorter amount of time than I had, my previous years in the Christian denomination that I used to be part of, and at different schools that I used to attend. So, yeah, I think that it's kind of been a little bit of both for me, and I feel very fortunate now to be in a phase of my deconstruction where like I do have a lot of folks around me with similar values and goals and interests and emotional intelligence, who is not afraid of people who have different ideas.
Yeah, that's great. So part of your work is, you write, you're very present on social media, and your goal is, liberating theology, spaces that include all of us, especially those of us who have been not included for so long. How do you think our spiritual places, our churches, our houses of worship, are any place, that is supposed to be a safe place, can do better about all the isms? I mean, because you walk into any church and it's not going to take very long. I mean, it's even in the hymns we sing. I've noticed there's ableism and Satanism and sexism and homophobia. That's not an ism, but close enough. I mean, the racism is a huge issue right now. And by right now, I mean, always has been. We're just talking about it finally. It seems like such an overwhelming task as individuals and as a collective to address all of that, but what can we do? I mean, either at the micro or macro level, just.
I think that a lot of folks in the church are lacking a lot of love and nurture and compassion in their lives. And I think that the church has to start reframing a lot of conversations to take that into account. Mm-hmm. I don't mean that in the sense of like, not like confronting the real problems and the real issues. But I think that like one of the big issues that we see in the church is like we're taught to police one another for sin in each other's lives, and how just like toxic that is, and how harmful that is. And I think that our ways of doing community in the church is a lot of times not a safe place mm-hmm. for anybody to be themselves in a way. Because, you know, growing up in the church and as a pastor's kid, I felt a lot of pressure to just exist in a certain way, to be a certain kind of a person, to do or not do certain things, to uphold a certain standard of purity culture when I was in youth group, you know. Mm-hmm. I felt like just absolutely suffocated by all of the rules that some were kind of explicitly placed upon me. But I think that what can be so insidious about the way that we treat people in the church today is that we police ourselves so much. And we tend to be so mistrustful of our own selves, that kind of fear-mongering that we hear a lot of times from church leadership and from the pulpit and from other kind of places of authority in the church. We end up, policing ourselves. We end up hiding parts of ourselves that we think are too shameful to bring to the surface. And it's just that's not a good place for any human being.
Right. And if we're operating out of a place of like fear and shame instead of out of a place of like love, you can't really build relationships or community that way.
Yeah, exactly. And yet people still wonder why churches are dying. You know, like to me, I'm like, that is the least surprising thing in the world to me, you know, that, these communities aren't thriving.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I don't want to go sit in a room for an hour once a week and be told how terrible I am.
Right?
Like I do that to myself. Like, I want to go somewhere and not think about that.
Yeah.
It's like, I have those like voices pretty well handled. Thank you. I want to go somewhere and be told that I'm loved and that everything will work out somehow eventually. But as long as we're here together, we got this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I tend to call it a piece of shit theology that the church tries to instill in us.
Yes! Like, oh gosh, that's perfect.
But like that, I think that really is the feeling of a lot of folks in the church, that like we feel like that we need to believe at our core that we are just fundamentally broken, that we are literal garbage, that we are pieces of shit unworthy of the miraculous grace and redemption of this religion.
And it starts when we're kids.
Yes, absolutely.
It's like when you hear as a little kid, you killed Jesus. That's going to mess with you for a long time. Yeah,
absolutely.
Like I would much rather, like there's got to be better ways to go about it. That especially for some of us who are a little more neurospicy and either take things too literally and or perseverate on negative thoughts, or, you know, any one of the other things that keep us up at night.
Yeah. I I think that like the way that we are disoriented from ourselves is like really, really what kind of keeps people controlled by the beliefs and the folks in power in those kinds of churches. I think that when folks are able to like use those beliefs to kind of manipulate and control other people, and like I think that that definitely shows up in a lot of ways, and definitely starts from the time, you know, that we're kids in vacation Bible school or Sunday school or kids church or whatever it is, you know, like the indoctrination starts nearly from birth.
Yeah, like just like the difference in pastoring in this within the same church is like one pastor who says, it's not my job to point out your sin, it's my job to preach the gospel, and the Holy Spirit does the rest. And then the next pastor in that church who stands in the pulpit and tells you that like certain people in your community are demonic. Like that's a big difference in like tone. And it's the difference between like, I believe it's like, oh, I can experience liberation from generational trauma. Like that is good news to me. Like that's going to keep me coming back because like I need that. And that's what I want. I like, that is a thing I need. And if that is something that God can do for me and this community can support me through, I am going to keep being part of that community because I need to be liberated from like generational trauma. I need, if you can tell me, if the good news means that I don't have to live like this anymore and I can live a different way, that's what I want. If you're going to stand up there and tell me that me and my partner are demonic, I am not going to come back. Like, I don't know why that's so hard for people to understand, but it's like so ingrained.
Yeah, it's so frustrating that like evangelicals, I feel like, have come to a place where like this idea of like the truth is so like disembodied in a way, like the truth is because that's what I find is the rhetoric that I always come back up against when I'm like, well, you know, that this is not the only way to interpret this passage, or this idea is just like completely like psychologically like harmful to folks. Like it has been studied, y'all. And they're like, well, it's the truth. We have to stand for the truth. Nothing else matters except for the truth. I'm like, what truth are you worshiping that it is like so divorced from our experiences and from other perspectives? Like truth can only be this one little thing that you say it is, and that's what the truth is, and everyone else, you know, be damned because of that. Like that does not feel like a healthy way to conceptualize of like determining what is good in the world, what is like morally advantageous. It just doesn't seem like a good framework to me.
And even suggesting that a framework and a lens are choices we make is like a completely foreign concept I think to a lot of people, that like, okay, you say this is the truth, but that is a lens that you are choosing to apply to your reading of biblical scripture. Well, no, it's just, that's what it says. Okay. This is your translation of it and your interpretation that has been handed down. Yeah. That's a heuristic. I'm with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very frustrating to try to have a conversation in those spaces. Like it can feel very defeating at times, I think, for a lot of folks. And I think that's why a lot of people like feel hopeless in the church. And even I, as like who, you know, is training to be a clergy person, like I completely empathize with that. I absolutely hold no grudges against folks who who feel that way, because I too, in a way, feel that a lot of times. And if you can't be your most healed, liberated self in the church, then that's okay. Like, I don't think that the God that I know and love is about healing and liberation. And so if a space is not conducive to that, I don't think it's on any individual's fault that like they couldn't make it work or something. I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, a lot of conservatives, a lot of conservative Christians feel like that, and some explicitly say that like their churches, their religious spaces are like the only places that we can like experience God in a meaningful way. I don't think that God is exclusionary. You know, I don't think that God can be confined to a particular congregation or to a particular denomination or to a particular religion.
That's a pretty small God.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
right?
I'd hope he's bigger than that. Yeah.
Yeah, we're supposed to believe that God like created the entire cosmos. Like, I don't.
But he attends that church on the corner.
Yeah.
I mean, he might. I mean, he probably does. But like, and also these other ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once you have completed your ordination, like what is it that you like really want to do?
I definitely do want to continue kind of the work in digital spaces I've been doing. I hope to, continue cultivating and growing and expanding that. And I hope to continue growing as a writer and continuing to kind of create that way. I am hopeful that one day I will get the opportunity to serve as a pastor in a local congregation. I think that would be wonderful. But at the same time, I'm trying to hold the future loosely.
Thanks again to Chloe for taking the time to break some of this down for us. You can find Chloe's digital work at Chloe J. Specht, that's SPECHT.substack.com, or visit Chloe's Linktree for a full list of resources, which I will provide in the show notes. Thank you for joining us on this episode of HORF. To view the complete show notes and all the links mentioned in today's episode, or to get a full transcript of the episode, visit hoorfpodcast.com. That's HOORF podcast.com. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you can receive new episodes right when they're released. And if you're enjoying our podcast, I'd love to have you leave us a review in Apple Podcasts. Reviews are one of the major ways that Apple ranks their podcasts, so even though it only takes you a few seconds, it really does make a difference for us. Become a patron. For $3 a month, you can support the creation of this podcast, pay my editor, and join a community of fellow caregivers out here just doing our best. Thank you again for joining me, Elle Billing, in this episode of HORF. Until next time, be excellent to each other. HORF is hosted by Elle Billing at Elle and Wink. Audio editing by Ricky Cummings at Ricky Poo. Music composed by Ricky Cummings. HORF is a production of Elle and Wink Art Studio, all rights reserved. HORF Podcast can be found on social media channels at HORF Podcast, at HOORF Podcast.